Right, good afternoon. Good to see you here. I'm going to, I suppose as mentioned, I wear several hats. Wear a concrete centre hat one day and a masonry hat another day, and an architect's hat as well, just to confuse the audience completely. So I'm going to be talking about designing for healthy and resilient homes, and I'm going to be picking up on some of the themes that Tom ended up on his discussion as the number one item. I think it's fair to say that we have a range of publications. Tom has covered this, and I'm not going to spend too long on that, but our audience is usually architects and engineers, but also clients and users and procurers of buildings and procurers of housing. So we have potential for a greater public sector involvement in housing, where the interest in the housing built is much longer term than perhaps the house builders, where it's a house owner who has the longer term interest. So I'm going to cover some of those points. Chris has covered what modern masonry is up to. Clearly there's an overlap, and I think it's worth saying that, reminding you that something like 85% of housing at the moment has an inner leaf of concrete blocks. You may not know they're there. Many people don't actually know what their houses are built of, and most of them think it's the bricks on the outside, assuming it is brick. So it's worth just giving it a quick tap when you walk round, and if you get that hollow sound, then you know that it's probably not going to be concrete. So we're talking about really a majority of housing as it's currently being built, and as it's currently meeting standards. I'm going to be talking about well-being as well, health and safety and well-being. Some of these slides are taken from the publication I showed, which was 10 years review of key issues for industry and those involved in house building and design. Well-being is a subject that has entered the marketplace probably too late, you would argue. It's not just occupants of housing, it's occupants of offices, and it's trying to understand how to create environments both now and in a changing climate in future that will make sure that we're both healthy and comfortable. So I'm going to move on to that, but I'm also going to touch on some other themes that designers and specifiers are now being bombarded with. They're all aiming at the same place, but from a range of different directions. This quote, resilience is all about being able to overcome the unexpected. Sustainability is about survival, and the goal of resilience is to thrive, I think is an excellent starting point for architects, designers, and those involved in the built environment in trying to look at the long term. And this is also reflected by UN Sustainable Development Goals, which you may or may not have read about. But it's very interesting to note that healthy buildings, or health and well-being, is item number 3. It's only when you get to item 11 and 12 where you get down to the built environment and building sustainably. They're all important, of course, and they all have interfaces with each other, so you wouldn't ignore any of them. But it's a change, I think, in perspective as to how we look at designing our built environment. One of the issues, I'm going to have to put my glasses on, one of the issues that I've raised in a couple of slides here is health and safety. If you're in business, health and safety is one of the key issues, whether you are a producer of products, if you're a building owner, if you employ staff as a company, health and safety is right up there. But of course, just to pick up on some of the Hackett review, the link between the various stages of a building being designed or the products being produced and the end result is a range of different people who are interested in it and involved and responsible. And certainly Hackett looked at the fact that there was a lack of a golden thread leading from beginning to end, and I think that's clearly going to be part of the changes that we all in the construction industry are going to have to take on board. Quite how that's going to happen, we'll wait and see. But in a couple of slides, I've just looked at some of the responsibilities. At work means health and safety at work, but designers, they've got CDM and building regulations are there to help you. And then once the building's built, you've got owners, landlords, occupiers who are suddenly responsible for a building. And the health and safety of that and its ongoing upkeep is obviously a key issue, both in private sector and the public sector. If you look at health and long-term well-being and the in-use part, of course, some of the responsibilities get extended. And one of the material issues that is coming to light is that you're responsible for the building, you're responsible for the design, its construction, you then own the building, but someone is then also responsible for what happens when it gets demolished. Are those materials safe to demolish? Can they be reused? Can they be recycled? Are they useful at the end of life? And in an earlier discussion today, we were talking about how long should buildings last. If you're a building owner, you usually want your building to last as long as possible. Although the lifetime of a mortgage seems to be extending quite a long time. I'm told that if I get to 80, I can still have a mortgage. A few years ago, it stopped at retirement age. I'm hoping to get to 80, by the way, but I'm hoping to get rid of my mortgage before that. But some of these measures that were used in terms of how people looked at property life and how long they were going to last are having to be reconsidered. So health and well-being is now recognised by a government as an issue for public health and safety. They're looking at reliance on the use of healthcare services. I'm pleased to say that most of us are living longer. Most of you have achieved quite something already, but also there's whole levels of educational attendance and attainment and productivity and absenteeism if you're running a business, which is all to do with healthy buildings. And there are some new standards around which you may or may not have come across. Originally very much driven by the office and commercial market. So WELL standard, Fitwel and BREEAM have all had healthy building issues built into them for some time. And BREEAM domestic refurbishment also has a healthy building. It's interesting to look at the key issues which touch on some of the issues that Tom touched on. Daylighting, sound insulation, the emission of VOCs, for instance, and ventilation. So all those issues that Tom touched on are very much linked to how to produce a healthy environment. And more recently, probably about 3 or 4 years old now, is the Home Quality Mark, which BRE have brought out to address housing. It's unlike previous standards, it's very much focused on the house owner rather than the house builder. And so I've listed a whole range of things which I won't go through, but they are all key issues there. I highlight comfort, indoor pollutants, daylight, internal, external noise, sound insulation, and then durability of construction, and then recyclable waste, water efficiency. So there's a whole range of issues now that are moving up the scale in terms of issues that designers need to take on board. So moving from health and safety and healthy beings then leads me on to the resilience part of my talk, because I think it's fair to say that we are recognising that the climate that we're building our buildings for is changing. We're designing buildings for 50 or 100 years' time, and even now we're getting the odd freak weather which challenges some of the design considerations for which the buildings were built. The UK Green Building Council has done a whole thing on health and well-being in homes, and I just draw your attention to the top left-hand corner, which is what I'm going to be talking about, which is choice of materials and then the resilience issues. End-of-life resilience I've touched on, but when you're talking to a client, very few clients as an architect have I met who know how long they want their building to last. This morning we saw a client who knew he wanted it to last at least 100 years or longer. But these are key questions when you're making material decisions and design decisions about property. So how long will your building last? What will happen to the materials at end of life? Are they safe to reuse? Can they be recycled? Do they have to be burnt? Do they create or absorb carbon at end of life? These are some key questions. And I think it's fair to say that most of us recognise that keeping a building to last as long as possible is a very good way of meeting some of the circular economy requirements. The longer it lasts, the longer your investment in product, materials, carbon is useful. And the longer before you have to then downgrade the building to a point of having to rebuild it. So reusing your structure is pretty key to that in a whole range of building types. There are those who are looking for design for demountability as a way forward. Probably difficult to justify the cost unless you have a relatively short-term building. But again, I don't think anybody's really worked out what those key parameters are yet. But it is worth pointing out that concrete, which is concrete and concrete blocks, are 100% recyclable. So at end of life, you can reuse the material. And to touch on something that Tom loves to talk about normally but wasn't allowed to today, when you crush concrete at the end of life, it reabsorbs carbon to something approaching 20% of the original embodied carbon. So if you're taking a whole life view of your building materials in your building, that's something you need to think about. So I think it's fair to say there's a lot of noise about building lots of new houses, but we are struggling to get anywhere near the 300,000 that I think is generally accepted as a minimum. I've taken this article from Housing and Planning, and based on the current replacement rate and our building rate, the houses we build today need to last about 2,000 years. And quite clearly, very few of them will, unless they have an awful lot of work done on them. So even masonry houses lasting 2,000 years, I think, would be a claim too far. So again, looking at reuse is quite important, and this just re-emphasises some of the key issues, because it's not just how long does your structure last, it's how flexible the building is for change to accommodate over a longer lifetime its using. So I think the other thing we talk about in terms of resilience and looking at refurb and new build resilience is some of the things that we should be designing buildings to cope with in the future. And extreme weather I've touched on, combustion, overheating Tom's talked about, energy efficiency, flood, and then some key issues like carbon reduction and waste reduction, which we need to be thinking of. And we've already seen, and unfortunately regularly see, flooding and storm damage on the news. And the overheating has come about, I think, a few years ago. There were thousands of people who died in Europe over a very hot summer. And we've had a very hot February. I needed to correct Tom. I think your February slide could be in question now. But I don't think the angle of the sun has changed. It's just the temperature. So other resilience considerations that you as designers and or building users or procurers need to think about are a range of how materials operate. And I think it's fair to say that resilience, if properly considered, is good business. People don't necessarily see housing as business, but actually it's people's largest asset as an individual, and clearly a key part of meeting the requirements of a growing society with growing aspirations. So I'm going to talk briefly about fire. It's a sensitive subject at the moment, and we're still awaiting to see how the post-Grenfell fallout will impact on standards, and consultation in Part B is going on at the moment. But it's fair to say that fire safety of occupants is essential and it's part of building regs, but there's not a lot in building regs about the impact on the property itself. So getting people out is key consideration, no one would argue with that, but then the question is how long does the fire burn and what's left afterwards? I think is a key issue we need to be considering. It's a sustainability issue in the sense that buildings that are set on light by vandals halfway through their construction is not a sustainable solution. It's criminal, no one would argue with that. But there are some key issues there we need to be thinking about how we don't have to build things twice. And there's a range of design guidance and recommendations from the British Insurers Confederation because they clearly have an impact. People have to insure buildings and they're worried about the risk arising from some building types and constructions. So I'd leave you on the fire safety bit. Safety behaviour is a major reason for fires, but I think it's fair to say that the design characteristics of a building will affect the potential for a fire to spread or to be undetected, and therefore impact on the likelihood of fire causing harm. And those are not my words, they're the word of a government paper in Good Housing. So the message I would give you is we ought to be looking at low risk construction details using non-combustible materials. Concrete and masonry obviously fit into that. And then look at also beyond the materials the consequence of detailing, poor workmanship and alterations when the building's finished. What do people do? They drill holes, they cut openings, they leave buildings not in the state that they were originally designed, and I think that's an issue we need to be much more careful about. So careful detailing is required, as it would be with all materials, but I think it's fair to say also that masonry doesn't need special measures required for health and safety during construction. So we'd promote a non-combustible structure. It does have key benefits in the event of fire, but it doesn't prevent fires. So I'd also look at some very good free fire detailing guidance issued by LABC, that's the Local Authority Building Control, and they have a range of details that are appropriate for masonry construction and how to make sure that the spread of fire is limited. So moving on to other resilience issues we need to be thinking about. We've touched on overheating. Tom's talked about it. I'm not going to spend too long on this because there is some overlap. But interestingly, whilst there is a map there, a heat map, even the Scottish government are worried about overheating, and it's not because necessarily they'll get the same temperatures as the southeast, but of course a lot of it is to do with lack of ventilation and bad design. So overheating can be a problem even in Scotland. It's difficult to consider. I've lived in Edinburgh and I think it's one of the coldest places I've ever spent my time in, but it was in one of those tenement buildings which were built out of lots of solid masonry, so I blame the construction. So one of the things Tom normally talks about is the passive approach to reduce overheating in new homes, and this is using ventilation and some key issues in terms of orientation, solar shading, planting. You can plant to protect your house from too much sunshine, the thermal mass aspects that Tom's spoken about, ventilation, and I used to have a house in the south of France, and I can remember there, we're promised that climate by the way, but unfortunately not quite in my lifetime, but the population there moved from one bit of shade to the next, and they walk around and they keep their shutters closed, they keep the sun out all day, so there are ways of living to overcome in those already existing in, say, where Mediterranean temperatures exist. And if the warming happens as predicted, the south of England is certainly going to be having very similar temperatures, not in my lifetime, but certainly in the lifetime of the buildings we're designing now. The thermal mass potential for cooling, these are one of Tom's slides, and I'm not going to go on, but it does help create and even out temperature differences, both in winter and summer. It does have to have ventilation with it. It has to work in that way, and it works in some buildings better than others. It's not a panacea for all cooling, but it is something that needs to be considered as a designer when you're looking at residential, and of course it's almost a no-brainer in office buildings. There's a lot of guidance, not from us, I hasten to add, from range of guidance. We have got an overheating brochure on our stand, but there's a lot of guidance from NHBC, for instance, and I thought for architects it's always good to relieve the words with a few pictures of buildings that have used thermal mass effectively with masonry construction. Tom has already alluded to some of these publications available for free on our website. And the part, I think it's, Tom admitted to say that he's about to spend his life updating Part L when the government review building regs, which are coming up this year. And so we'll be looking very closely at how that impacts. I think we all thought got to a point where the external fabric of the building was at an optimum level. A little bird tells me that that might not be so. So we might be finding that higher levels of insulation to the envelope are on their way, with all the implications that go with that. But I don't know that, that's just me guessing. But either way, I think combined with changes in Part B and Part L, we're up for some quite significant review of how we build and design our buildings. So Tom's covered the construction with thermal mass, walls and floors. I'm not going to go into that. So we then move on to flooding. And unfortunately, many of us live in areas where flooding and the Environment Agency warnings are a familiar tale. Those of us who've lived quite a long time can remember whole bits of London being flooded. A lot of that has been remedied by good measures, but they still reckon that 1 in 6 properties are at risk of flooding in the UK, and clearly the increase of 40% in residentials exposed to flooding by the 2080s is a pretty frightening thought. I think there's a very simple argument, is we shouldn't be building where we are building, but unfortunately the economics of using floodplains for housing drive that, and still are driving that. I think there are some significant measures that are now reasonably being taken to ameliorate some of the impacts. There is a document that I'd lead you to, which is the Property Level Flood Resilience document, came out in 2016. And it's a part of a DEFRA initiative to try and address this issue. I'm afraid that all these resilience issues have been overtaken by Brexit in the last couple of years, but hopefully we'll get back onto more reasonable subject matter soon, without hopefully the flooding that might provoke them. I think it's also worth mentioning that flooding doesn't always happen where the Environment Agency says it's going to. We quite often get flash floods from places that no one anticipated, so it's worth again looking at the local geography and the potential. Unfortunately, if you're mining in Brazil, some few uncertainties there in terms of impacts of sudden failure of some of our infrastructure. And even at a water pipe mains level, it can cause pretty good chaos in UK. So the latest guidance is BS 85500, not to be muddled with 8500, which is the latest concrete BS, lightly reviewed. Sorry about that, but I couldn't resist. There are some clear definitions and recognition in there of some of the things that concrete can do and timber can't. Again, that's something that needs to be looked at by a designer when he's making those design decisions. As you know, concrete comes in a variety of forms. One of my colleagues calls it like mixing a cake mixture. It's just a matter of which bits and what parts you put in to come up with what recipe. So the variance and the variety is enormous. So when you say concrete, people think of one thing, but actually it's thousands of different potential materials and makeups that can be designed specifically to suit a particular requirement, and they are. I don't think anybody can talk about concrete at the moment without mentioning embodied CO2. It's not something that you can avoid. It is an existing issue. But interestingly, if you look at the NHBC guidance on housing, the difference in embodied CO2 between a timber frame house and one with masonry at day one is negligible. And if you take into account the thermal mass benefits over the life, after about 11 years, it's overtaken by the efficiencies of thermal mass. And after that, of course, there are huge benefits. It's always nice to have a bit of a relief. People ask, where do your products come from? It's fantastic that they're local and they come from round the corner. If you live round the corner, it's not always a huge benefit, but afterwards, I think there are something like over 400 triple SIs which are now used as nature reserves, which are created from cleaning up and making sure that quarrying is not a disaster but a benefit to those at the end of its life. Pretty critical. And there's a whole range of nature notes and other issues that come out of that, where the post quarries are used for both recreation and natural environment help. I'm going to leave you with two slides, one of which is just looking at the traditional sustainability headings of social, economic, environmental, and some of the resilience and key issues that I've been talking about. I think taking structural performance as read is reasonable with concrete, and then if you look at the tick boxes, there is a whole range of issues on the resilience performance of the product. And if you go to our stand, you'll see there's a document that says concrete credentials, which can give you a lot more detail on that. And I always finish on this slide because it's got nothing to do with housing at all. I don't think anybody has lived in either of those buildings, but they rely heavily on concrete and brickwork, and they've been around for over 2,000 years. So on that note, I'll leave you to ask me difficult questions, I hope. Thank you.